So thank you to the organizers, Casey and Autumn and Andrea, and thank you, Lisa, for occasioning this gathering of so many good and smart people. I'm very honored to be here and to participate in this way. As Charlie said last night, one of the marks of Lisa's cast of mind is the word and especially in the sense of both and. In that way, she's very, I think, deeply Catholic. She tries to overcome dichotomies as much as reasonably possible. And I think really she's a person of enormous intellectual empathy, epistemic humility, and what David Hollenbach calls intellectual solidarity with those with whom she might not agree. When writing critically about the work of her peers or her colleagues, Lisa expresses herself in a style that is gentle and constructive rather than intemperate or contemptuous, and she incarnates what Kathy Caveney calls the ability to engage in prophecy without contempt. I'm going to focus on her concern with her longstanding focus on the least of our brothers and sisters, as others have as well, her care for and attention to the most marginalized and vulnerable populations in the world. This ethical commitment, I think, runs deep in who she is as a person and is complemented by a strong conviction as a Christian ethicist that authentic love has to generate a passion for justice and concrete action for justice. This will be the focus of my comments on Lisa's contribution to how many of us have come to think about the family. A recurring theme of her work can be capsulized as proposing that we apply the preferential option for the poor to marginalized families, and particularly for marginalized girls and women. Lisa writes about a whole host of issues regarding families both in this country and throughout the world. Her abiding conviction is that the well-being of marginalized families provides a necessary criterion for assessing the usefulness and adequacy of normative claims about families made either by theologians or the magisterium. Since I have only a few minutes, I will note 5 important themes in Lisa's work, all of which could be commented on in much greater detail. First, if we're to say anything about what might be useful to people today, we need to speak in terms of families rather than the family. In the United States, 28% of households are composed of single persons. 41% of children are born to unmarried mothers. Globally, 38% of families live in multi-generational households. And in many countries that have deep Catholic history, the majority of children are born out of marriages. 65% in the most Catholic country in the world, Brazil, and 84% in Colombia. So we have to speak of families, multiple family forms, and not have in mind only the template of heterosexual, monogamous nuclear families. We have single-parent families, as I've just mentioned, blended families, gay and lesbian families, or families of choice, and we have split families. The diminution of the stigma attached to these relationships, at least in the West, is a great gain. Speaking theologically, we have increasingly come to recognize that grace is possible in many forms of family life, and that many families, in fact, live sacramentally, that is, as concrete signs of the reality of divine grace, even if they are not officially recognized as such. Nuclear families are still vital, but church documents can take them as the exclusive norm of the family, and in fact, in doing so, fail to speak to many families who do not conform to this paradigm. As Julie Clegg notes, there's a massive gap between the vision of marriage and family promoted by the church in its official teaching and the various attitudes, values, lifestyles, and practices that can be witnessed in the many diverse social and cultural contexts in which the church has its being. Secondly, we must come to terms with the fact that marriage is not a necessary foundation for families. The American bishops offer a theologically modified definition of family as follows. The family is an intimate community of persons bound together by blood, marriage, or adoption for the whole of life. Whereas Catholic teachings and moral theology typically treat marriage as the foundation of the family, Lisa helpfully argues, quote, what most essentially and specifically constitutes family is not the married couple, but the parent-child relationship, extending backwards and forwards in time in the form of ancestors and descendants, close quote. This standpoint acknowledges the wide variety of families that mark not only North Atlantic societies, but also the variety of extended families that characterize the Global South. Those who think the solution to the crisis in the family, quote unquote, is to strengthen heterosexual nuclear marriages, strongly fail to meet the concerns and pastoral needs of families that take other forms. These include families whose members suffer from addiction, eating disorders, debilitating mental illness, sexual abuse, and domestic violence. Offering moral advice on the virtues needed by married couples or the norms to which they must conform does not really help people struggling to love in very complicated life circumstances. The primary value of families, the primary virtue of families that work well despite setbacks and hardships, is an abiding capacity for unconditional love. Helpful is Pope Francis's practical commitment to solidarity, compassion, gradualism, building a culture of encounter within the family, and I think for me above all, accompaniment. As the Pope puts it, the Church must be a place of mercy freely given, where everyone can feel welcome, loved, forgiven, and encouraged to live the good life of the gospel. Thirdly, we must appreciate the fact that families constitute their own common good, and not just a social setting within which individuals pursue their private happiness. The culture of autonomy in some ways provides leverage against the male dominance that defined the patriarchal family for centuries, but it also tends to diminish families' sense of us. Against expressive individualism, Lisa argues that the family constitutes a particular common good of its own, which must be the object of our care and stewardship. The common good of a family is not only the aggregate of the good of all of its members, but rather the good of the whole. A healthy family seeks to do what is good for us, considered as a whole, but has to provide an alternative to the construal of us that tacitly or explicitly requires women to subordinate their well-being to the good of other family members. Lisa is among the leading feminists who rightly insist that good families are based on a deep acknowledgement of the equal dignity of all family members, and that generally promotes the agency of all of its members rather than some at the unfair expense of others. This obviously implies that the good of girls carries the same weight as the good of boys, that household tasks not be assigned on the basis of gender stereotypes, and contrary to the notion of male headship, that women are entitled to participate as equals in all familial decision-making processes. This might be obvious to us, but it is not necessarily to everyone. Fourth, we would do well to recognize that the common good of families depends upon the common good of the wider communities and societies in which they are embedded. Families need not only moral exhortation and spiritual guidance, but also access to resources made possible by just and equitable social institutions, laws, and public policies. The common good of families is seriously hampered by economic insecurity, unemployment and underemployment, unsafe working conditions, lack of educational opportunity, and economic exploitation. Grinding poverty makes family members vulnerable to trafficking and sexual exploitation, substance abuse, and violent crime. If we had more time, it would be useful to examine in some detail the interesting case of an organization founded in 1964 by Jesuit John Halligan and Madre Miguel, a BVM nun, in Quito, Ecuador, called Centro del Muchacho Trabajador. The center began with an initiative to give impoverished shoeshine and street worker boys an opportunity to get out of poverty first through daily meals and rudimentary education, And then as the program expanded, Padre Juan and Madre Miguel discovered that if they want to help the boys, they have to help their families and they have to help their sisters. So they expanded to training each of the boys in one of the trades, but also their other siblings, to provide healthcare services, housing allowances for their families so that the boys could actually go to school rather than have to work signing shoes to bring money home to feed the family. The program expanded to include microloans to start small businesses, culture enhancement, and further education. The organizers of the center realized that if they wanted to help the boys, they had to help their families, as I've stressed. To capture their agenda, the center was renamed the Center of Working Families from the Center of Working Boys, a community they describe very eloquently as a family of families. To date, over 6,000 families, or around 30,000 people, have left poverty as a result of the center's holistic programs. If you want to give poor children a chance, you have to help their families. If you want to help their families, you have to attend and give them an opportunity to develop ways of supporting themselves, and in supporting themselves to contribute to the wider community. Family values, as the expression often is used, is really not encompassing enough of the true goods of families, which includes stability, gainful employment, and most importantly, hope for a decent future. The requisites of this are affordable housing, healthcare coverage, and physical safety. Indeed, there is no larger crisis of the family today than the plight of 84 million forced migrants around the world. The implementation of the norms of Catholic social teaching, the common good, human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity, would, if implemented, do a great deal to strengthen vulnerable families than any amount of moralizing about traditional values. Fifthly, and finally, we ought to recognize and acknowledge that families have a responsibility to contribute to the common good of other families, the wider community, and their larger society. In the West, an increased emphasis on autonomy and authenticity encourages us to think of the family as what Robert Bellah calls a lifestyle enclave within which individuals seek their personal fulfillment. The Catholic tradition, in sharp contrast, conceives of the family as a community of love that cultivates Christian discipleship and an ethic of service to others, to non-family members. This Catholic vision, and really biblical vision, has several implications. First, Jesus warns his disciples not to allow loyalty to family ties to lead them to abandon or water down the costs of discipleship. Many New Testament texts depict Christian communities as fictive family in which all members are brothers and sisters with one Heavenly Father. Secondly, families should be neither entirely inward-focused nor function as in-groups unconcerned about others. These families are part of the Christian community and not just on their own. In my opinion, Catholics have a lot to learn from their evangelical brothers and sisters and their congregations when it comes to taking care of one another. Third and finally, nor should Christian families only care about other Christians. Christian families and discipleship generally ought to be marked by both a hospitality that welcomes the stranger into one's home and outreach to marginal members of the community who don't feel comfortable coming to one's home. In Lisa's view, the most appropriate model of the Christian family is neither the patriarchal nor the nuclear family, but what she calls an open kin network that enables love of God and neighbor through hospitality and service, in a way that reaches out to the have-nots, misfits, and losers that most parents tell their children to avoid. Complementary to Lisa's emphasis is an understanding of family as a community of disciples formed by the story of Jesus, as our good friend Bill Spohn once depicted it, and as a domestic church, as a number of the doctoral students, former grads of BC here, have reflected on intelligently and published stories and articles about. The kind of loving praxis Lisa recommends to us takes its meaning from the kenotic love of God for the world. It envisions our telos not only as an earthly flourishing, but also and more deeply as eternal communion of God, with God and one another, made possible by our cooperation with the transformative power of grace. Lisa's model of the Christian family is centered on the ethical praxis of agape, and offers a more Christian alternative to the practice of religiously devout families who have not been open, let alone willing to extend active love and hospitality to the other, and to those who hoard their wealth and other resources rather than share them with those who have been left out. Many staunchly Catholic families who would not be tempted to miss Mass on a holy day of obligation have been utterly oblivious to their own class, race, and gender biases. Some of Archbishop Romero's fiercest opponents, and the fiercest opponents of the Jesuits that were killed in El Salvador in 1989, were devout Catholics who saw no connection between the salvation of souls, service of the outcasts, and working for structural change to promote justice. If we know a tree by its fruits, then the Christian family can be identified not only by what it professes, by what it lives. Lisa has made a major contribution to Christian reflection by insisting that theologians, the church, and ordinary concerned Christians look at families as they actually are today and not as we wish they were. If we do not face the complexity and the power of challenges to families, we will have nothing useful to say to them. She is right to insist that we must move beyond a very narrow conception of the family as heterosexual nuclear married couple and their children, and into the concrete complexities of real families as they exist in our own communities and around the world. Her normative contribution is to develop an ethic of the common good shaped by the preferential option for the poor, and especially by her recognition that families need to be supported on many levels, not only by the moral goodness of their members, but also by just socioeconomic policies. Building up the common good of families puts them in a position to contribute to the well-being of their communities and civil societies for the benefit of all of us. Thank you.